Yeah. So what beliefs have shaped your life and work?
I love that the theme of the festival is belief, because it really caused me to think about this question, which is sort of what are the guiding principles of my life and my work, and really distill that down into things that I carry with me in work that can be incredibly draining, and in life that can be incredibly draining. And so much of what sustains me, I think, is coming back to just really fundamental principles of love and kindness. And I work in the law, which is a system that's really antithetical to those beliefs. It's a system that really tries to extract from people their humanity. It's a system that tries to take away our impulses to love and care for each other, and really sanitize that with abstraction. And so the second sort of framework that I really utilize in my work is to remember always and to interrogate the fact that as an agent, as an actor in the legal system, I am always doing both harm and good. And I think that as a lawyer, one thing I feel really committed to is the constant reminder that our system of laws is a system of white supremacy that was constructed for the purpose of maintaining chattel slavery and has at its core anti-blackness and racism. And so no matter how good and pure my intentions are as a civil rights lawyer, as a social justice advocate, when working within this system, we are always distributing harmful costs because of the nature of the system. And so it's important that if we do want to come back to principles of love and principles of kindness, that we recognize the violence of the system that we're operating within. And that's something that I try to carry with me every day in my work, especially in this moment where in a quite troubling way, I think, we are looking to lawyers as some sort of heroes in the fight against the current administration. And I think if that's where we are, then we've already given up too much ground, because the legal system and the courts are not going to save us. They can be a tool, but they are not our saviors. And so that's something that I try to really hold on to.
It's powerful. Like Chase said, we've never met in person until today, a couple of minutes ago. And we have connected online, and I see the kindness. I see the love through your Twitter feed, the way that you uplift other narratives, and the way that you are a parent. James Baldwin once said, "I've never been in despair about the world. I've been enraged by it. I can't afford despair. You can't tell the children there's no hope." I know that you're a parent. What do you tell your own child about the future? What do you want them to believe in, and what gives you hope?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I think I spend most days just trying to make sure that we're all alive at the end of the day, and the broader principles can sometimes be lost with those mundane goals. No, but I mean, I think one of the beautiful things about parenting for me is the ability to watch a young person approach the world with an entirely fresh set of perspectives and see how she makes meaning out of difference, and see how she constructs narratives that are really different than the narratives that I construct out of any given situation. And it's a reminder of how much real possibility there is if we take a step back from the assumptions and the life experiences and the traumas that hinder our imagination, and really let ourselves think about constructing narratives from a place of newness and a place of creativity. And so when I approach, I feel like thinking about parenting, mostly I have like really troubling things in my mind about all of the ways that I failed. But also, I do sort of think about just making sure that my child's questions the structures of power that are in place, including my power, unfortunately, which I think is part of why we have such a hard time. But in general, it is beautiful to watch young people have so much hope and possibility, and it's also really troubling to see how quickly that is taken away. And so trying to act in a world to make more things possible for young people, for the elders in our community who are dying. I really see both those things, and making sure that our youth have the ability to construct the lives they want to lead, and that the elders who have laid the foundation, that have enabled us to lead the lives that we lead, don't leave behind a world that they feel so devastated by.
Totally. That's powerful. I love that. I love seeing the next generation being empowered with hope and being able to pick up the baton. What a legacy for your daughter to pick up. Cece McDonald once said, "We can't talk about radical action without talking about love, without loving each other." Many of the people I see as heroes were radical human beings who were motivated by a deep love for their people. Jesus, Dr. Martin Luther King, Sylvia Rivera. How do we leverage love and radical action in the fight for civil rights?
For folks who don't know who Cece McDonald is, Cece is a Black trans woman who was living in Minneapolis, and she was targeted in an attack one night, a vicious attack by a group of white individuals who were very aggressive in attacking her with racial slurs, with anti-Black slurs, with transphobic slurs, and she defended herself, and she survived and didn't become one of the statistics of the many trans women of color who are murdered every year, but she was sent to prison for manslaughter as a result of her decision to fight back and survive. And Cece spent several years in prison in Minnesota, and is, to me, an example, like so many of the people that I work with, who have, in the face of so much cruelty, in the face of so much violence, found the strength to be a voice of love, a voice of compassion. I think also of my client, Gavin Grimmâ, who is a teenager from Virginia who fought to be treated like other boys in school and took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. And Cece and Gavin both talk so much about love. And Chelsea Manning, too, another person that I've worked with who has experienced just unbelievable amounts of violence and torture. And I think, first and foremost, it's a reminder to me always that the people who are the most impacted by the systems are often the ones with the most insight into how to break them down, are the ones who lead with the most compassion, who give way more than those of us who have so much. And Cece is such an amazing example of that. And her words are a repeated reminder to me as a lawyer that it won't be through legal change that we're going to transform the system. Cece often was asked, well, would you feel safer if you were in a women's prison? Because like so many trans women, she was housed in a men's prison. And she would repeatedly say that, prison isn't safe for anyone. And she didn't want to have a simplistic conversation, even when her life was on the line. She wanted a conversation about robust, transformative change. And she always and continues to center that and center the experiences of the people who are killed every day by the system, whether it's through individually perpetrated acts of violence or whether it's through the slow administrative neglect of our government systems that take away healthcare, that take away housing. And Cece is a reminder of building with love and not looking for an answer that constrains us by what's already in place, but imagining a liberation that's so much greater than what we already have before us, even in the face of being slowly killed by the prison system, being slowly killed by the traumas that are so unequally distributed in people's lives. I mean, I really just urge people to listen to Cece speak, because it is, to me, it's hearing from people like Cece. It's hearing from hearing the voices of people who have a truly liberatory vision of change, that is the way we lead with love and kindness. It's about connection, it's about authenticity, and it's about never giving up your power, and always realizing that you are an agent, even in the most egregious forms of government action, to take away agency. And I admire Cece so much, and her survival and her willingness and her fight to survive should be something we really learn from.
I find it interesting that when I asked you about love, you named Cece, you named Chelsea, you named Gavin. You gave their existence space. And when you thought about love, you thought about the humanity of these people. How do we juxtapose the story of Cece McDonald against the story of Chelsea Manning, who served the longest prison term by any whistleblower in the history of the United States? She served a prison term of 6.5 years, and you represented her when she came out and sued to get access for comprehensive medical treatment for her transition. Why is Chelsea Manning's story important in the quest for trans liberation, and what are the larger ramifications of Chelsea's release?
Yeah, Chelsea's story is a complicated and interesting one. I think the sort of first lesson to take away from Chelsea's story that I feel is important to reflect on is sort of her prosecution and the nature of her prosecution in the first instance. So Chelsea was in the military, as probably most people know. She turned over documents in the public interest for publication, including some of the most famous things that we know about now related to the collateral death video and other things about war crimes that we were perpetrating across the globe, as we always are. But Chelsea was prosecuted under the Espionage Act, and I think that her case is a really important reminder that things were not perfect under the Obama administration. And it's so easy. I mean, God, we're like glorifying the George W. Bush administration right now. So we have a lot to really be taking a step back about, because not only were things horrific under the second Bush, both Bush administrations, but they were also pretty terrible in many ways under the Obama administration. And it's so easy now to look back on those days and think everything was perfect and lose sight of the things that that former President Obama did to give a lot of very disturbing executive power to current President Trump. And Chelsea's prosecution in the war on whistleblowers is one example of the Obama administration's actions that are going to come back to haunt us repeatedly. And Chelsea's story is a reminder of the dangers of government power when we're not holding our executive branch to account. Because, you know, President Obama, when he was president, proclaimed Chelsea's guilt before she was ever tried. As a constitutional lawyer, he should be ashamed of himself. And frankly, I think he was ashamed of himself, which is part of why we saw the commutation. But so his actions and the actions of the Obama Justice Department are sort of a disturbing example of sort of the path that got us to where we are. And then not only that, once she was incarcerated, once she was sentenced to 35 years and she came out as trans, it was the Obama Justice Department that basically said, under no circumstances are we going to provide you access to health care. And so there was this real juxtaposition between the position that Loretta Lynch and the Justice Department were taking with respect to trans rights, and then the positions they were taking in Chelsea's case in court. And it was a real example of how there was this fracture between this idea of civil rights for civilians, and then this real repression of civil rights in the context of prisons, in the context of whistleblowers, and frankly in the context of the deportation machine that Obama was overseeing. And that was a really hard thing to witness, because on the one hand, I was working with the Justice Department in North Carolina to sue the state of North Carolina over their HB2 law, and was really moved by Attorney General Loretta Lynch's remarks about trans people. Mm-hmm. But I was also suing that same Justice Department over Chelsea and their refusal to provide her with health care. And I think that was a constant source of frustration and something that we really wanted to hold the Obama administration accountable for. And so the commutation campaign around Chelsea Manning's case and the request that she be set free after serving the longest prison sentence in United States history of any whistleblower really did sort of play to Obama's legacy on LGBT rights, which he was very proud of, as far as we could tell. But I think Chelsea was a real example of where he fell short. I think there were a lot of examples, and to me, it's a reminder that it's not just about the explicit LGBT or sexual orientation and gender identity laws that are our measure of how our government is doing with respect to justice for the LGBT community, because what we really need to be looking at are the way how are we tackling problems of mass incarceration? How are we dealing with immigration enforcement? Because if we're building those carceral regimes, if we're killing people inside, then it doesn't matter how many laws you have protecting you on the outside, because at the end of the day, the same people are going to be driven into the prison system and denied health care and ultimately have lives very tragically cut short. And so Chelsea's case was a lesson in sort of the complexity of an administration that was really touted for its position on LGBT rights. And then the other thing about Chelsea's case that I think it's important to note is that the law with respect to prisoners' access to health care is actually one of the most well-developed bodies of law with respect to transgender individuals. And the case law is very much favorable to trans people receiving health care while incarcerated, and we were able to build on that law. And it's a body of law that was developed almost entirely by trans women bringing lawsuits pro se, bringing lawsuits on their own without counsel. And it's been actually instrumental in building the law that we have protecting trans people, not just in the prison context, but in the context of health care across the board. So access to trans health care under Medicaid and access to trans health care under private insurance programs. And so Chelsea's case really stood on the work of generations of incarcerated trans women. And frankly, as a white trans person with access to way more resources than most people have when in and out of prison, she had a lot more freedom and access than a lot of other people, including when compared to Cece, who I think came out of prison with a lot less than what Chelsea did. I mean, Chelsea came out with hundreds of thousands of dollars in book deals. Cece did not. And so I think, that's an important thing to realize, and that when we're looking at the interventions, even in the context of criminalization and the prison regimes in our country, a lot of times our work to end mass incarceration, our work to improve civil rights of prisoners benefits white people first, like all of our work. And just because it's work aimed at mass incarceration doesn't make it racial justice work unless we're working to focus on the anti-blackness and prioritize the experiences of people of color. And that isn't to say that Chelsea's work wasn't incredibly important. It was. It just was built on the work of people of color, and her outcome was better because she was white.
So as you juxtapose Cece against Chelsea, and Cece is a woman of color, I think you so brilliantly highlighted the privilege that lived in the situation. There are many transgender women of color who, like Cece, experience disproportionate levels of violence, unemployment, homelessness, and lots of high risk across the board when it comes to the sanctity of their lives. We live in a world that is often especially dangerous for those who hold multiple marginalized identities. What are some examples of legal protections that have been or can be put in place that impact and address the aspect of intersectionality and reduce the risk of those who are most marginalized?
So speaking for myself and no organization that I'm affiliated with, I guess, I would say, I'm someone who I don't believe we have put in place really many laws that we can say meaningfully impact favorably people's lived experiences. I think you'd have to look back to to sort of the growth of public assistance programs, the the ability, anything where we had a redistributive impulse in government, which I don't think have at all. We spent the last decades cutting back government programs, cutting back Medicaid. I think 1996 was probably one of the worst years of lawmaking under President Clinton in the history of the United States. It resulted in the so-called welfare reform, which cut back people's ability to receive public assistance. It resulted in immigration reform, which led the way to the mass deportations we're seeing now. And I don't want to say that civil rights laws do nothing, although I think they do close to nothing. And they are symbolic and they are important. And certainly I'm not speaking for the ACLU when I say this, because I do see why we aspire to add protections for people. It's important that people feel like they can go and have a job and not be fired because of who they are, and that's essential. At the same time, it has not resulted in anything resembling equity, racial equity. There's nothing resembling gender equity, even though we've had in place laws protecting people for a very long time. And I think the reason for that is that we have, is capitalism first and foremost, but also that we have very few labor protections in general. So you can put in place all of the protections in the world, but if you have an employer who's savvy enough not to say you're fired because you're trans, you're fired because you're gay, you're fired because you're bisexual, then you're fired because you're black, then your protections are really limited unless you're in a union, or you have some other form of contract. So I think it's a little bit unfortunate that as a movement, the LGBT movement is looking towards formal equality as the answer, because I don't think it's going to be saving lives in the way that I think we need to be looking towards. What I think we need to see are efforts like decriminalization of sex work, mass efforts at decriminalization, and mass efforts at ending mass incarceration. Because I think the vulnerability that people experience, the marginalization, the instability of their housing access, the instability of their employment access, is not going to be fixed by putting into a place a law that says you can't discriminate in employment based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Because the reality is that the courts are getting worse. Businesses are getting savvier. And so what we really need is to increase access, redistribute resources, end criminalization, decriminalize drugs, end cash bail. I mean, these are the things that are keeping people locked up, keeping people out of the job market. And if we know that Black trans women, for example, are experiencing incarceration at rates, or at least law enforcement contact and arrest at almost 50%, then if we don't end discrimination in the workplace based on past criminal conviction, then protections based on trans status are going to do nothing. And so what I want to see is not a movement that's obsessed with court wins and expansion of civil rights laws, but of measuring tangible life outcomes and survival opportunities. That's about ending criminalization. That's about redistributing cash resources. Because unfortunately, without that, you can look at a place like New York City, where we've had explicit protections for many years, and you still have high rates of incarceration and homelessness because we don't have in any way a redistributive impulse, unfortunately, which is in part the fault of the legal system, which is why I don't think we should rely on lawyers.
A lot of those things are on the institutional level. So what can everyday citizens do to promote trans equality?
I think that so much of the work is, coming back to the impulse of being kind and loving and authentic and sharing, is to go out of your way to learn about other people and give back what you can. And one thing that I've learned in doing a lot of organizing work around cash bail is watching people show up for one another when they have so few resources. And so, as I think there's a broader awareness, in part because the Obama Justice Department started to attack the problem of cash bails, we now understand that most people in our nation's jails are being held there pre-trial because they can't afford bail, which is especially prescient now as we're watching people walk away from these massive indictments, posting millions of dollars in bail, when you have people who are in jail because they can't afford $500 bail on a trespass charge and then staying in jail for months and months. And it's not explicitly about trans people, but trans people are so caught up in the criminal legal system and so disproportionately likely to be held in on bail because they don't have supportive family in the courtroom, or they don't have a job that they can show, or they don't have immigration status, or they don't have a supportive community that the judge recognizes. And so these are the interventions that make a huge difference. And I think paying attention to the ways in which the operation of our criminal system impacts different communities and using the resources that you have to disrupt that is one of the most hugely supportive things that you can do. Contribute to bail funds, go to gatherings in your community and meet people and really learn about, well, what are the barriers to participation? Pay for people to get their identification documents changed, pay for people to, have access to a job because they can't afford public transit or whatever is the barrier in place. It may not be what we think it is. It may not be that they're walking in and being discriminated against because they're trans. It may be that they can't actually physically get to the job. And so I think we have a lot of work to do to make visible these types of barriers, to share our access, share our resources, give people rides, give people cash, learn about people's lives, use the skills that you have. If you're an artist, make art. If you have access to multimedia production, then tell stories and use cultural narratives, because that's how we're ultimately going to make so much change, and that's how we're going to give people the hope that they need to survive. In Gavin Grimmâ's case, for example, his case was supposed to go to the Supreme Court. It had the possibility to be a very transformative legal precedent. But at the end of the day, it didn't. We can talk about what happened legally in his case, but ultimately, I've come to terms with the fact that we probably were going to lose, and it's maybe good that we didn't get it to the Supreme Court. I just remember that this was being recorded, but we weren't going to lose. But we were definitely going to win. But also with his case, it was such a reminder that it's so much about the stories that we tell publicly that change the nature of our experiences in the world. And I joke about how Laverne Cox, during Gavin's case, got up at the Grammys and told everyone to Google Gavin Grimm. And in the next week, we accomplished more in our work than we had in like 10 years. And so it was a reminder that, all right, we're toiling away in court and it's fine. But also, it's so much about making visible people's humanity and making visible the truth of their lives. And Gavin was such an incredible messenger because he just was himself. And we gave him the stage, and he told a story about just trying to live as the person that he is, which is something I think we can all resonate with, and we want to hear that story more. We want to listen to people in a different way and give them platform when we can. And that, I think, is going to be the way forward. It's if you're Laverne Cox, you go and you say that at the Grammys. If you're just random person over here, you go into your school board and you either speak for the Gavin or whoever, or you make space for someone else to speak. And there's so many little opportunities for that if we really take a step back and look for them in our lives.
I love how you point out tangible opportunities in our community to get involved, assist in someone's bail, provide transportation. I think so many times we get involved in the national scheme of things, and things feel so overwhelming and so helpless.
And I think one of the things that really concerns me about the narratives that we're confronted with right now is that we're so fixated on the president and the federal government that we've completely lost sight of the power of a lot of other levels of government over our lives. I mean, the reality is there would be no President Trump if there wasn't a systematic taking over of state legislatures, school boards, and city councils for years that was very deliberate. And if you look at the map of what the GOP is trying to do at the federal level, it's the same playbook we've been fighting in the states. It's voter suppression, it's redistricting, it's anti-LGBT laws, it's pro-mandatory minimums and increased sentences. And these are all things that have already happened in the states. And if we were more engaged in our school boards, if we were more engaged in our city councils, if we were more engaged in our state legislatures, we might not be so surprised at what happened at the federal level. But I think it's very strategic for us to lose sight of the sort of micro controls, both at executive agency levels and in our local legislatures, of what's going on in our lives, and that's the pathway to what's going on at the federal level. But it's the voter suppression in the states that it's North Carolina. If you look at North Carolina, you can see how we got to where we are, and that was a very systematic takeover of a state general assembly by the GOP, and here we are acting all surprised about what happened, and then still not engaging in local elections. So I think there's just it's so easy to focus on the biggest enemy or the sort of flashiest change, but ultimately it's the smaller interventions that I think are going to both save lives and lead to the more transformative change in the end.
How does, in kind of bringing the local into the national, bringing them together, how does Trump's reversal of Title IX in pushing Gavin's case from the Supreme Court to the Fourth Court of Appeals, how does that shape precedent in future cases in schools and colleges surrounding young trans individuals in the United States using the restroom that aligns with their gender identity? So the question of the scope of protections for trans people, I think, is one that the Trump administration is deliberately trying to make confusing, and I actually think it's relatively straightforward. So Title IX is the federal law that prohibits sex discrimination in schools that receive federal funding, which is most schools, all secondary schools, the Trump administration came in and Sessions, as Attorney General, made very clear that they wanted to reverse Obama-era policies that clarified the scope of protections for trans students. So in May of 2016, the Obama DOJ issued guidance about the scope of protections for trans students. It basically said trans people, like all students, are covered under Title IX, but they didn't change the law. The law is a law that was passed by Congress. It didn't change under Obama, and it didn't change under Trump. All that changed was the interpretive guidance from the agency. And so from my perspective, from the perspective of the courts, nothing has changed with the scope of protections except that schools and entities that want to discriminate have a little more cover from the federal government, and people are more confused about their rights. But I think it's important to know that both Title VII, which prohibits employment discrimination based on sex, and Title IX are still very much in place, and that people still retain the same protections they did under Obama. And in fact, the courts have almost universally for the past 10 plus years held that trans people are covered under those laws. Now, what we should be very concerned about is the fact that the Department of Justice under Attorney General Jeff Sessions is very much committed to rolling back those protections in court and confusing people and acting as though those precedents aren't in place by issuing new guidance that says, no, we won't defend you. I think the difference is that the Obama administration's, the Obama Justice Department did defend Title IX and Title VII in court on behalf of trans people. But you don't need the federal government to defend you, because you as an individual can go enforce your rights in court, and that hasn't changed at all. And so Gavin's case, even though it didn't result in a precedent in Gavin's favor, in part because Sessions came in and made the issue a lot more procedurally confusing and it had to go to the lower courts to be sorted out, Gavin's case was critically important because
Gavin's story changed people's understanding of trans people, which is ultimately how we make progress in the courts. But the courts have been pretty clear about the nature of the legal protections themselves. And there's an incredibly moving opinion from the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals that the judge who wrote it has since retired, unfortunately, and it's probably because he was retiring that he wrote such a moving opinion. But the case gets remanded from the Supreme Court, and the Fourth Circuit basically, all they have to do is rubber stamp it and send it back down to the lowest court, basically accepting what the Supreme Court has done. But in what was going to be just a one-line order, Judge Davis from the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals writes this beautiful 4-page opinion, which I urge everyone to Google, about Gavin and his place in history and what he represents. And it's not the thing you usually find in legal opinions. It's beautiful, it cites poetry, and this is not how court opinions usually go. And it had no legal purpose but to affirm Gavin's humanity. And so in that sense, I think we won Gavin's case. Gavin never got to use the boys' bathroom, but he wouldn't have had that chance no matter how the Supreme Court came out because he graduated from high school before his case was litigated through the courts. But he won because he changed the public conversation. Judge Davis wrote that opinion that saw the humanity of trans people in a totally different way than we have ever seen in the courts or really anywhere in sort of the chambers of power. Loretta Lynch, as Attorney General, stood up at a press conference in North Carolina and said some of the most moving words that I've heard a government official say to the trans community. And this was all in the context of Gavin's case writ large. I mean, that was in the context of fighting HB2, but it was part of the story of Gavin's fight. And so I think I want to caution against making individuals the heroes of our stories, because I think that is a problem with the law and a problem with our country in general. But I think the power of individual storytelling, especially when collectivized, is how we're going to make these legal changes. So Jeff Sessions can say whatever he wants. He can think the law means what he thinks it means. He's wrong, but he's also going to lose. And he's going to lose because we're building power over time. And I think if we don't get caught up with the tallies in courts and the laws that we pass, and we instead are focused, as we were in Gavin's case, on building power and spreading power, then ultimately we're going to be successful. And I think we're going to be successful in a much more transformative way than if we simply looked to the courts to tell us what our lives meant. And instead, we're looking to the public, we're looking to the courts and telling them what our lives mean. And that's really different, and that's really, I think, an important lesson that I took, at least, from Gavin's case and the shift in our strategies over the last year.
Thank you. And thinking about moving judge edicts, the U.S. District Judge Colleen Cotterly ruled last week that the transgender service members who had sued over Trump's military transgender ban were likely to win their lawsuit. She cited that the administration had provided no solid evidence for why such a ban should be implemented. Under the Obama administration, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. How do you feel that the larger impact of this kind of cultural war that the Trump administration is putting forth, in your opinion, what kind of precedent is this setting for trans individuals in the military?
So in July, out of nowhere, as far as we were concerned, and seemingly as far as the Secretary of Defense and the entire Defense Department was concerned, Trump went on Twitter and announced this new ban on trans people serving in the military in a series of 3 tweets. And Secretary of Defense Mattis was on vacation at the time and was quoted as saying he had no idea that was going to happen. And it was followed by a guidance document that came from Trump to the Defense Department, basically saying, implement my Twitter ban. And and a bunch of lawsuits were filed. The ACLU filed one. The lawsuit that was ultimately successful in the District Court of D.C. Was filed by NCLR, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and GLBTQ advocates and defenders. And there's a whole host of other lawsuits, much like with every one of Trump's executive orders. There's many lawsuits and many court decisions striking down the actions of the administration. It's complicated because Trump's Twitter is like our best friend as litigators because he is so transparently animus-driven and acting out of impulse and in such blatantly unconstitutional ways. And so we get these court decisions, which are huge wins, basically saying, you can't do this. And so I think that this decision is good and it will hold. As to, the military ban 1.0, but as we've seen in the progression of the Muslim bans, for example, is that the administration is very much trying to exhaust us all, and they're confusing people. Trump declares things on Twitter, and then there's a series of executive actions, either coming directly from the president or coming from the agencies that he oversees, and then there's a series of lawsuits, and then those lawsuits get mooted out because the policy changes, and we're all exhausted and confused. And I think it's very deliberate. And so as much as I'm optimistic about the court sort of looking at these tweets and saying, my God, this is ridiculous, which of course it was, I do think that it's just the beginning of a larger fight. And it's really disconcerting because we're going backwards on so many levels, and it just concerns me that we're all going to get very exhausted. It reminds me when the Supreme Court struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. It was like at the ACLU, our voting rights project had sort of gotten much smaller over the years because of the effectiveness of the Voting Rights Act. And then here we were starting from scratch, and now there's just law after law suppressing black votes, suppressing votes, and in addition to that, those things in and of themselves being devastating, it's emotionally devastating to have to just rebuild entire projects that you dismantled because you thought you made progress. And the military ban is another example of this, where it was something that was checked off of people's list. It was, open trans service was finally achieved under President Obama in 2016 after years of advocacy, after years of study, after Don't Ask, Don't Tell being struck down, which was the ban on LGBT people serving openly in the military. The ban on trans people serving was retained and then finally overturned in 2016. And then all of a sudden, with 3 tweets, it's like this huge part of our work again. So not only is it just disconcerting to go backwards, it takes a huge amount of resources to fight each of these things. And so I think it's very promising that the judges, at least at the district court level, are saying, these policies are transparently unconstitutional. We're going to strike them down. I don't think the administration is going to be deterred. I think we'll see new iterations of all of these policies. And then I think the other really concerning part is that they're also appointing very, huge amounts of federal judges. And so the landscape is changing, not only the legislative landscape and the executive landscape, but then if we look at the judiciary as a place where we do want to have, some accountability, even though, again, I caution us looking to the courts as our saviors, we want them to at least be effective in some, to some extent. We have judicial nominees who are scary for a lot of reasons, and so we can look to the Judge Davises at the Fourth Circuit who write beautiful opinions about Gavin, and the impartial district court judges who strike down the military ban, who strike down the Muslim ban. But if we're not careful, that's all going to change. These things will start being upheld. And so we really do have to stay vigilant, not just about what the president does on Twitter, but who he's nominating to the federal bench and what's happening in our state legislatures, because so much is changing, and I think we are going to all grow very tired if we don't share in the fight and pay attention on a lot of fronts.
We must stay vigilant, and we must share in the fight. So powerful. In getting ready for our interview today, I read one of your colleagues said that you are one of the most powerful advocates that she's ever met. And I could not agree more. Chase Strangio.
Precious.
Thank you so much, Chase. We're going to take some time for a couple questions. Please ask questions, not comments.
And feel free to ask Precious questions, too, because she has more insight than anyone.
Oh, my gosh.
Hi, I'm Mark Wojcik. I'm a law professor at the John Marshall Law School in Chicago. Thanks for coming here and for your work in New York. Your comments on laws don't matter is really a bit disturbing, because they do. They make a huge difference, because there's thousands and thousands of companies, schools, government, that make things better because the law has changed. And my question is, can you say, is there in your mind a difference between adding gender identity, gender expression, gender identity and expression? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Can I start out?
Yeah.
As the Black trans woman on the panel, some laws don't matter. I worked for an LGBT center when I transitioned. When I transitioned, that LGBT center refused to change my name in the email system. They were breaking the law. Laws don't keep transgender women from being murdered on the streets. They still are murdered with incredulous violence. So although people know the law, that doesn't mean that people aren't getting raped, as we see in the Harvey Weinstein case, as we see with Donald Trump elected to the highest office in the land. Laws don't keep things from happening. They do often hold people accountable, and often in those cases, as we often see with many men of color, justice is not applicable to everyone. As we see Philando Castile, the list, Trayvon Martin, justice and the law did not rule supreme in those cases. White supremacy reared its head fierce and strong. And so I just want to kind of push back in saying that the law doesn't protect everyone. I think Chase talked a little bit earlier when we look at the stories. Like when we hear the story of Cece McDonald and we juxtapose her against Chelsea Manning, Cece didn't have all of the resources when she came out. The law didn't protect Cece. The law incriminated her and said, because you chose to protect yourself one night, we're gonna lock you up. She was protecting herself. And so I just wanna point out that, especially among those who are most marginalized, the law does not always rule on the right side of history.
I think that's a lot of where I come from. Is we have so much faith in the law, and we talk so much, especially now, about looking for people who believe in the rule of law. And I just really want us always to question what that means and for who. And I was referring specifically to civil rights laws, and I think that obviously there's a long history of fighting for inclusion in the formal legal equality frameworks that we subscribe to in this country. And I've also watched how fighting for inclusion of access into those laws has taken away from broader fights. And so would it do more to fight for access for, for more robust labor protections for everyone, or more people included in non-discrimination lists? And I just don't know that the answer is always inclusion in the enumerated lists of classes of people protected under our civil rights laws, because I've just watched time and time again the people, especially who live at the margins of intersecting identities that are targeted under the law, not finding relief within the legal frameworks. And I'm a lawyer. I practice within the law. Of course, I'm being somewhat flip about it, but I think we should be a little bit. We should take with our faith in the law a very healthy dose of skepticism. When it comes to the question of, do we need explicit enumeration of gender identity, gender expression, or are we better off, I guess, in the alternative, advocating for inclusion under existing sex discrimination protections? I think that we've made some mistakes in our advocacy. I think the concept of gender identity, and the enumeration of protections based on gender identity has been both confusing and not reflective of people's experiences. And I wish that we had named the advocacy differently. And I think had we talked, because if I'm fired because I'm trans, it's not because I have a male gender identity, it's because I'm trans. And so I think we've sort of confused the conversation a bit, and trying to separate out trans people from non-trans people, and sort of actually erased a lot of our experiences and our advocacy within the non-discrimination framework. So I am not someone who's going to spend my days as a lawyer fighting for the expansion of protections based on gender identity, because I don't think that's going to benefit my community. I think that, of course, when individuals are experiencing discrimination, or when I have clients who want to utilize the existing legal frameworks to vindicate their rights, absolutely, I will make every argument at my disposal, including arguments based on disability, which I think are hugely important and something I would never shy away from out of fear of the stigma attached to disability. But I guess my larger point is that as I think the movement for LGBT rights made a huge mistake in our prioritization of marriage equality and what that did, I think we are poised to make yet another mistake in our prioritization of formal equality, especially in the context of so much systemic discrimination, and especially in a moment when we're seeing so many communities under attack. I think our interventions should be different. Do laws matter? Sometimes, of course. They matter in every sense. They control our lives. Our civil rights laws are paths to justice and liberation? No, I don't think so.
Yeah, and I think of those who are experiencing high rates of homelessness. I think those who are experiencing HIV, who experience vast amounts, of systematic discrimination in the world.
Hi, I'm an employment counselor, and through the years I've worked with people with disabilities. And one of the biggest issues I had to deal with is just talking to employers or managers about their fears or their prejudices. And I guess my question would be, if somebody who is transgender is able to be offered a job while they're transgender, what would be accommodations, or what would be different? And would there be anything different that an employer would have to be concerned about?
You want to take that one? You want me to?
Yeah.
I feel like you had some experience, some lessons.
So, I think in terms of when hiring trans individuals, I think it's important to look at forms. Not all trans people legally change their name. When it comes to identification, not all transgender individuals, their legal identification matches with the gender that they identify with. It's referring to them as the name that they go by. My employer, I was working for an LGBT center that refused to change my name in the email system. And I worked for the LGBT center, for heaven's sakes. They told me that I needed to legally change my name before they would change it in the system. At that time, I was making $33,000 a year, living in Lakeview, paying for a studio apartment as a young trans woman. I could barely afford, out of my $1,000 paycheck every 2 weeks, to take out $500 to go and pay for the cost of a name change. Because in the state of Illinois, you have to pay the legal fees, you have to publish it in the paper, you have to go downtown, so that means you have to take the day off work, that means you have to take the train to go downtown, and not all trans people have the resources to do this. So I'd say it's important to look at the inclusivity of what does your paperwork look like. Also, when you look at the cis heteronormative world, someone whose name is William often goes by Bill. When William is hired, he's going to be called Bill. He is not going to be called William. So it's giving that same preference to trans individuals. Often when someone gets married and they change their last name, we quickly change the last name and we update it. It's the same thing for trans folks. So ensuring that the documentation, that it's open, and I think sometimes it's important that people are educated with cultural competency. I think implicit bias training is important. We all have implicit bias with which we navigate the world. I think that's a culture. It's kind of, how do you curate that culture in the office? And I think it's not just for transgender. I think we should be talking that about ability. How do we navigate space? How did each of us get to this room? faith, in terms of the different things in which we believe, in terms of holidays, in terms of socioeconomic status. You know, often I remember my first job, people were like, do you want to go to lunch? I could not afford to go to lunch, like at that time. I had to bring my lunch. So I think it's always kind of like addressing inclusion in general, you know. So I would say looking at your forms, being culturally competent, and sometimes you might have to bring a consultant in to come up with, and someone who is in the community, you know, and consultant to come in and look at your policies, to look at your structures. You know, are you providing comprehensive health insurance? Are you providing mental health services? So I think sometimes bringing a culturally competent consultant in to come in and create an infrastructure that supports trans people as well.
That sounds good.
We have time. We have time for just one more short question.
You mentioned the decriminalization of sex work, which I'm curious about because I work with a sex worker organization in Chicago, Swap Chicago. Are there any opportunities to sort of move the decriminalization movement forward on a larger level, even though laws might not matter as much, but curious about this one.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is another, you know, it's interesting because by our board policy, the ACLU has supported the decriminalization of sex work since the 70s, but we haven't invested a ton of resources in that work. And again, it's like we pick priorities, and it's difficult to gain traction around movements when you have sort of the most progressive candidates in sort of national politics being staunchly anti-sex worker, Kamala Harris being one example. And so you have people in politics coming from a prosecutorial background and being very invested in criminalization, which makes it very difficult. I do think that the laws, the areas of law that are ripe for changing and challenging are the loitering laws, the loitering for purposes of prostitution, the laws that are incredibly overbroad and target people, especially trans women of color, who are profiled as sex workers and picked up under these loitering laws just for standing and engaging with each other. And we've had some successful lawsuits on behalf of individuals in that context, and some state laws and local laws have been struck down under the under due process and the First the First Amendment. And I think that's an area that's really prime for legal challenge. There is a current challenge to California's prostitution laws that is not going to be successful. That's at the Ninth Circuit. But I think having the conversations and thinking of it as an important part of the LGBT movement, of the movement for gender justice is important, because we're seeing so many people targeted, and both, it's a huge driver of incarceration to be pushed into obviously underground economies, and then to have your existence criminalized because of stereotypes about your participation in certain criminalized economies. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I haven't invested as much time as I wish I had, but I think there's a lot of promise there, and a lot of people who have devoted a significant amount of time and resources to thinking about how to build out those movements. And I think if we look at who we're also electing to be prosecutors, if we're sort of really looking at the movement to change the criminal legal system, that is a hugely important part of the conversation.
Chase Strangio.